Okay, we're going to go back and take a look through 1 Corinthians and just a few reminders as we do that of what has gone on. Is that here we find a book that was written, we often think about it, I think originally, as these people that are filled with problems, they don't have a clue what they're doing, what's wrong with them. Sure glad we're not like that. All the different things that people typically do when they approach the book of 1 Corinthians. I hope now, after having studied through it, that there's a little bit more empathy for these fairly young Christians who have come out of a pagan world for the most part. There were some Jews there, but it's largely pagan. And are trying very hard to let go of those previous ideas and way of thinking. Who don't even realize sometimes that they have taken their own culture and applied it to Scripture. We just kind of adjust to that and think this is the way it is because, well, everybody does it this way. Well, everybody that I know. Why? Because that's our Scripture. Why do we have say, how many of y'all have enjoyed the wonderful situation of a men's business meeting? Anybody here? Okay. All right. Now, and how do we decide what to do in a men's business meeting? We vote. And majority rules. Why? Because democracy's in the Bible. Oh, except for it's not. Okay. It's just an adaptation of. With very few, how do you figure those things out? Well, you really need to have those who are the most spiritual try to lead that. And you know how you avoid that problem? You keep developing qualified elders. That's what you do. Okay. But what we have to realize as you go through, that is a normal human kind of problem, and that nothing that we find within the book of 1 Corinthians is abnormal to the human condition. It's actually very much like how we are. And that's why when we look at the problems they had, the assumptions, the things that they just hadn't developed, the questions they had, that we ought to appreciate that more and to be reflective on those same kind of questions that we have and be honest with ourselves as we go through. So I'm going to, big picture, looking at this in sections. The first thing we note, remember that the book is divided in two major sections. So if you go through and you want to mark something down or note it, the book is divided based upon the first 6 chapters and then the remaining 10 chapters, really. The first 6 are devoted to 2 major issues, problems that had developed since Paul had left. And those problems were found and addressed in chapters 1 through 4, and is the problem of division. And then chapters 5 and 6, the moral problem of a man having taken his father's wife and how to deal with it. So those were the 2 issues. Now notice what we have here as a model. You have basically what amounts to division due to a doctrinal kind of division because of men. Okay, personality issues and men-driven things of how you get along in the congregation. And then, how do you handle sin? Those are 2 pretty big things that are universal. So, what he came down to, and he opens, remember, he establishes the authority, even within the opening of verse 2, it's talking about, it's based upon, this wording early on, with all who in every place call on the name of Jesus Christ our Lord, both theirs and ours. That is an appeal to his authority. He starts with that because he's wanting to get around to them to understand he's thankful for them, but they've got a problem. That's up to verse 10. And that problem is they've let individual teachers, or their love of individual teachers, not the teachers themselves, remember. Sometimes we think that that's the problem. Paul, Peter, and Apollos, and certainly Christ, had not done anything wrong to create this situation. It was the people who, because of their background, were used to dividing up based upon their favorites. That was kind of, if you understand a pagan world, they were used to kind of picking their favorite god and running with it. They had you got the big gods of the city, and then you had your private gods for the home. Well, they were just kind of following suit and picking out their favorites of this based upon style and those kind of things. And he says, no. He says, we're all together on this in that you need to be paying attention to Christ. There shouldn't be this division. Why? Because all this is centered around the gospel. And the whole idea, you need to remember what you left behind was, whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, that there were people who could not come to grips with the reality of Jesus' resurrection from the dead. Why could they not? Because there was no evidence? No, he's going to come back to that at the end of the book. That's why it's a beautiful unity of it. But it was because they already had decided within their previous system of belief that can't happen. Under the Gentiles, well, that's a ridiculous idea. No, everybody knows that doesn't happen. To the Jews, well, there's going to be a resurrection, but crucified Messiah, that's not who I read about. So because they had not connected those ideas, they determined, based upon their own previous belief, they had to reject that because they had assumed some things. But he comes back and he says, no. Not only am I talking to you about Jesus, he says, that's the basis of this whole thing. Because in verse 2 of chapter 2, he says, for I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. He didn't back off, he leaned in. It says, that's who the gospel is all about, Jesus, and the gospel depends upon the fact that he was crucified. Now he's going to come to the other end of it in the resurrection later on, but that's your starting point. And that is the foundation of the message. When you go to the rest of chapter 2, that was an inspired message. It says the Spirit provided this. This wasn't made up. This wasn't some fairy tale. This was what was provided by God. And so in chapter 3, he is going to address then the underlying problem. So he's addressed the heart of it, that is their background, then the understanding of Jesus, and what needs to guide you is the gospel. And then in chapter 3, what then created some of these problems? And it was because they were, number one, babes in their thinking, but it was because they were too much interested in wanting something themselves rather than to be what God wanted them to be. And this is seen in first of all, verse 6, where Paul says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. And then when he comes down to verse 11, for no other foundation can anyone lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. He then gives several other illustrations from that, all about God's ownership. God's ownership. And to not then, as he ends in, trust worldly wisdom, but instead, going back to what had been revealed in chapter 2, what God has said. So they were trying still to incorporate worldly wisdom and make that fit what they were doing, and he says, you've got to let go of that. So then he comes down in chapter 4, and he does something that he'll come back to and do in the next section as well. But he talks about it from his own point of view. Chapter 4 is all about Paul explaining what he is doing in his work. Now, go back and think about the problem he is addressing. Everything that he has done so far now, I want you to look at in this way. Y'all are divided up over personalities, including mine. That's not right. I'm here to preach Jesus. I preach Jesus because that's the message inspired by God. I am not here to promote myself. I am here to promote your unity based upon God owning you and you belonging to God. So in chapter 4, he comes and says, I am here to serve. It's not about me. He says, I don't know anything against myself, but he says, I'm not justified by that. I'm not okay and look at me because of that, because it's not about me. So then you come down, he says, you need to not learn to, he says, think beyond what is written, that none of you may be puffed up on behalf of one against the other. You don't need to be lifting men up, and that includes me. Now, he's doing that to make sure that they don't lift themselves up either. But he's wanting to make sure they understand this is not about men. This is about Jesus. So you'd better get your head around that. Stop thinking like the world and embrace Jesus as the one who was crucified, who died for you, that we are all here to serve our God, and that anything about us is just incidental as we serve. That's the mindset he was developing those first 4 chapters. So now he gets to chapters 5 and 6, and we introduce this new problem, which he just comes out and says in chapter 5, verse 1. Okay, what is this I'm hearing, that a man's taking his father's wife? And that's not even the worst part. Well, that we can deal with, as he's going to show them later. He says, the problem is that you're celebrating it. You're good. What has happened again? They're doubling down in some sense upon this idea of openness without standards, which is, again, because they haven't taken the gospel in as that core thing that they need to go by. And so because of that, these old ideas creep in. He says, but you're doing something that not even the world around you does and approves of. But see, they had grown to be far more loving. And he says, no, that's not what's happened. But we can fool ourselves pretty easily to thinking about how much we've grown, when in actuality, we've let loose our moorings and we're just drifting. Okay, so he gets down to says, here's what you need to do. So how do you handle this problem? And that's what really he does throughout these 2 chapters. The first thing he does is talk about, you need to discipline that person. You need to, which means you need to draw, because you're being affected and you will be affected by that. The standards go off. Once you start down in saying what sin, if we're going to choose what sins we'll accept and overlook, where does the list stop? So it says you got to go by the standards, and you need to do something about it. And understanding that there is this problem of influence, that's the leaven part he talked about. Why? Okay. But he does it with purpose. He doesn't just say, everybody, you need to shun people, and the only communication you can have is wagging your finger at them. That's not what he says here. The purpose throughout chapter 5 is you need to pull back from him socially, to highlight where he stands spiritually, not just with you, but with God. It's drawing attention to that because you're trying to save the soul. So what happens, and we went over this at the time, we end up wanting to save friendships and not trying to save souls. Okay? Paul was interested in saving souls. So they need to be aware of their sin, and they've been talked to. That's not been enough. So we need to have a big group demonstration of what's happened here. You're removed from God. And so then he closes this with a potential, he's considering the argument of, well, now, you said that judgment was all God. You ever heard that with people? We're not supposed to judge. He says, no. He says, we're supposed to say, you don't withdraw yourself from the world. This is the place in which we all agreed on this standard. We agreed we're going to operate on this standard, and therefore there is an understanding there. That's different than what's going on in the world. So you need to make sure your responsibility is to hold one another to God's standards that you already agreed on. That's the difference. People in the world, they haven't even come close to that. You committed to it. So that is the first thing he covers in chapter 5, is how do you handle situations like these? Well, there needs to be a proper kind of discipline, which we talked in at length, I think, about, where it addresses, you're telling them why. It is for the idea of saving them. It means that there is communication about their situation. It means that you are still caring for them, and that is your motivation, is love for them. And that should be displayed in those interactions with them while you're holding on to the standard of God. Why? Because if you look at the core idea when Jesus talks about two principles from the old law that applied, it was a love for God and a love for neighbor. Okay? But a love for neighbor never precedes or overwhelms the love for God we should have. A love for neighbor comes from our love for God. So if we decide, well, I'm showing love to that person, if your nature, you're showing love to a person requires you to do something that shows a lack of love for God, then you're doing love wrong. Okay. So then he comes into chapter 6. And this is when you get into the question about the idea of going to law. And we talked about this a little bit, that there is a carryover and connection that implies, this is mirroring, the looking back at what the situation is behind the scenes, that what appears to have happened is that the church had done nothing, and so the only thing that was left was, in that sense, legal recourse, so now we're going to sue over it. But now he's going then to the people who, in the society, to try to get his wife back. Okay? That's not the answer. Okay, and why? The reason why is that it's been created because you didn't handle it yourself. Okay? But you don't do that. Why? Think about what that means. You're just going around and advertising. We're really clueless here. We don't know what we're doing, and we're a mess. Okay? Self-policing. So he comes through on this, but notice when I say that on the connection, if you come down and he gives that list in verses 9 through 11 in chapter 6, at the head of the list often is fornicators head the list. Okay? That problem was significant. Okay? It was the reason for chapter 5 was a problem of fornication. He comes up and highlights it in the middle of chapter 6 after that discussion about the law, and then the entire discussion, 12 through 20, is about fornication. So why? Well, because he is wanting to address the underlying spiritual arguments and issues about fornication that created this problem in the first place. Why? Corinth was a pretty loose society sexually. So that understanding these standards, even in this situation, it was even worse than what they did. But now he's going to go back and talk about, we need to understand what this really is, and he addresses some of those issues and arguments, such as what you sometimes hear about the body is a natural thing, and all this thing, to whatever we can justify what we want to do with it. Whereas he says, the body is given to you by God. It's owned by God, and you're responsible to God for it. So that's what your takeaway needs to be, is how God designed this, going back to Adam and Eve, is for one man, one woman for life, because you were one. That's what y'all missed. And that's why you need to flee from fornication. So, two major issues, problem of disunity, problem of fornication. Now you get to chapter 7, and he begins a whole section he's answering their questions. And these are big questions. They're both practical questions, but for them, with what's going on in their lives, it's very down to earth about what they've gotten, just regular day-to-day kind of situations. So the first is marriage, which is a natural one to flow from after the question about fornication to while we're on this subject, let's transition there to your questions, which is to talk about what he has provided in marriage and how married people are to behave, honor one another. But what do you do if you became a Christian and you drop down here and it says, okay, but my husband didn't become a Christian. What do I do now? He says, stay married. It says, reverse that for a man, he obeyed the gospel, the woman did. What should I do? Stay married. Why? Because you should, in that relationship, number one, God accepts that marriage as being legitimate. And part of your purpose now in marriage is, because of your love, to try to convert your spouse. Then he goes on to a section that is much misunderstood, but the whole thing is God did not create Christianity to overthrow every social situation you're in. Okay? That's the misunderstanding about, well, okay, I'm a Christian now, so marriage off, and this says same thing about race, and your social situation, talks about Jew and Gentile differences, talks about the difference between being free and a slave. It says, that's not what this changed. It changed who you are spiritually. Now, if you understand the wording about becoming a new man, and this is the first time you've ever heard that kind of talk, you can understand why they would get confused a little bit, can't you? So he says, no, that's not what you changed who you are spiritually. And it doesn't change your social situation, it doesn't change your ethnicity, and it doesn't change the fact that you got married. So you need to deal with that. So then he goes down and says, okay, what do you do if you're not married? Well, here then gives some advice, rules, and there's this neat little thing here about in the present distress, indicates there's some kind of issue going on, perhaps a famine, that would make that not a good idea to take on that responsibility right now and starting off newly married. But then ends including what does a widow do. So you got those situations about what should a father do in regarding his daughters, what should a woman do in general, and then what should a widow do, take care of that. So that pretty much covers up all in chapter 7 issues about marriage. In chapter 8, he begins a new, larger section of big questions they had. But they are all organized, generally speaking, I'd say, around how should society influence me, or how should I interact with society? Because as you start off in chapter 8, he's dealing with matters of conscience, but the situation is food that's offered to idols. And what should you do about those situations? So he comes down to it, well, you don't cause a problem for anybody, but there's nothing to that meat that makes it special meat or problem meat. It's how you look at it, unless you're making a big deal out of it, or you're trying to, somebody else would, and you're not being sensitive to those situations of where they are. So again, it is where you are in society. How should I think about this? Well, if you've got someone who has recently come out of that, then they might have a bigger problem with a food that was offered to an idol that you go through, and you have to understand the shops that would sell it. Hey, this was offered up to this idol or that idol, and thinking that that's a bigger deal, rather than going through and, hey, that looks like that's a nice special I'll take. I like the price on that. So make sure that in these situations that you're mindful of the effect it would have in society if you're buying it or giving the impression that you think it's special because it was offered to a particular goddess. Well, that's a problem. You shouldn't do that. If you're just buying meat and it's just one of those things offered, fine, it's no big deal. So he wanted to make sure they understood that, so they could relax about the meaning other people were placing on things. But remember, the whole key as he went through that was the willingness to sacrifice and say, okay, if it's going to cause a problem, I'm not going to eat it. And that brings us to chapter 9, where Paul really then takes, just as he did in chapter 4, and he looks at himself and he walks through how he behaved. And he talks about how all the different things that he had given up in a sacrificial attitude at different times just for what was best for saving souls. So what he has done is he takes this time for these young Christians to say, I'm not trying to put a burden on you. I'm not trying to make your life difficult. But you need to understand that I do this. This is how I live, because I don't want to create problems for anyone. So, for if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for necessity is laid upon me. Yes, woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. He comes down to verse 22, I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Here he's talking about he adjusted what he did based upon the people he was trying to teach, because of their customs and practices. Not anything that he would accept that would be inherently wrong, but he's going to accept those practices so that he can simply say, number one, if it's not wrong, then he can do that. And he wants them to be able to relax so he can teach them the gospel. And them not get the wrong idea. You imagine if a Jew comes in and all that Paul had to deal with Judaizing teachers, if he came in and he insisted upon maintaining his Jewish eating customs when he was around them, they might get the idea they had to do that too. He changed from that because it was okay to do, Acts 10, to make sure they did not feel that as a burden. Star? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. All right, well, you were being Christ-like. Notice the assumption about what he already built in, that if you'll do what I want you to do, and that's how I'm going to judge whether you're Christ-like or not. All right? Then you just turn to him and say, give me some money. Christ got money from other people. Being very Christ-like. See the manipulation of how sometimes people do it? That's a common one today. Jesus was around all people. You know what? He would talk to anybody who was homosexual. He'd also tell them why they're wrong. He would explain to them what they were doing to their soul. And he certainly wouldn't celebrate their sin. So the kind of things where people, they kind of walk a couple of lanes toward Jesus and they decide to jump in order to get to where they are in society and to justify their own background. Okay, so when Paul was doing this, it was nothing that in any way gave the idea that anything they were doing that was wrong was right. It was to not put extra burdens on them of things that were right that, say, the scruples of the Jews applied to the Gentiles. That would be unfair. Okay, I mean, let's just think about what that would be. Okay, let's just be honest here. It'd be like, okay, one last thing. We know you're committed. You know and understand the church. We know you know the plan of salvation, and you know what's expected of you. We have one last thing: no bacon. It's pork. Okay, and well, it would be fine for someone who is Jewish to say, "I just can't eat that. I just can't get past that." But if it was given if Paul was given the impression that that was what Christians had to do too, that would be an unnecessary step of requirement that might hold people back, that would basically be enforcing what was actually an ethnic and cultural practice that they didn't have. That's what he was willing to step away from. And that's why, for example, it's hard in a general kind of culture that we have in America. Most people, it's fairly homogenous. But if you go to a different country, there are going to be different customs, y'all. It's not going to look like this. You don't do things the same way all the time. Doesn't mean it's wrong. That's the problem we get into, is if they don't do it exactly like we do it, that it's wrong. Went to a congregation in Kansas, did a gospel meeting. They didn't close with a prayer. They closed with a song. Can you do that? Yes. Okay, well, kind of shake you up when you've never done it, though. Why? Because you've just done the same thing, and their expectations are set on your experience instead of biblical practice. And that's what we need to make sure, that we're focused on biblical practice and what the Bible teaches. Okay. So that's what he was doing. Now, in chapter 10, he moves on from that, and this is where he is going back and showing the tie-in with the Jews, which is important to tie your Jewish audience back in. It's good for them too, right? What does he do with them, though? So I can just see Jews going, okay, yeah, I got you on that whole kind of idolatry thing, those people. And then he comes in and he points out, and he goes through the list, he's in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, 1 through 11, where it basically says, yeah, you people are idolaters too, remember? By making the nature of the content. Now, he's making a different argument there, But he's drawn them back in to understand the nature of what it is to be God's people, is giving up things, and that where the Jews were in their history that they needed to identify with were a problem. They need to get beyond that. Why does he need to do that? Because as he moves in to the end of chapter 10, he's talking about you get away from idolatry of all kinds. Okay? And then at the end of chapter 10, he talks about how whatever these practices, when you're making these decisions, you need to understand the principle of doing things to the glory of God, okay? And that is making decisions, chapter 10, verse 23, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but not all things edify. And the whole idea is what is the end? What is my purpose in doing there? What is the result? And so he comes down in verse 32, give no offense either to the Jews or to the Greeks or the church of God, that you need to be mindful of how your behaviors look to other people. And are you, in stressing, say, freedom, or we're going to do it this way, are you considering their souls in the process or their view of you and what Christianity teaches in the process? He then moves in the first part of chapter 11 to give an example of this, which is what the wearing of veils and the hair was about. It is an extension of that argument from chapter 10, and you can see that in the connection of verse 16. But if anyone seems to be contention, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. That is an expression tied to verse 32 of chapter 10. So then he goes in, he closes this off with a transition of the influence of the pagan world on their practices regarding the Lord's Supper. There was eating of things going on with the pagan practices, and they had incorporated that into the Lord's Supper, and they had also come around to their division problem was cropping up. And so he gets them back focused on what this is actually about, is to be an expression of unity, of faith, that is about everyone and what Jesus did for us, that needs to be expressed and be a proclamation to the world about who we are. So then in chapter 12, which begins another major section, which is dependent upon how you look at it, either ends in chapter 14 or maybe ends in chapter 15. The idea here is now we're moving on to the miraculous. And he starts by talking about, and it's interesting, he's going to get once more, I'll talk about the unity of the miraculous. Okay, he's come back to the unity each time, but the point is there's one Spirit directing all this and providing all these gifts. They had trouble because they were prioritizing gifts, and they were thinking certain gifts were better, particularly being able to speak another language that was provided. And that was so special. He says, no, these are all provided by the same Spirit, okay, that brought you into the church and the body, okay, when you obeyed in baptism. That was found in verse 13. And so as a result of that, 14 through the rest of the chapter, he discusses how you need to have the attitude that, and this is particularly about their miraculous gifts, it's basically this: all serve a purpose. He listed off all these gifts, and then he comes down and says, look, they all serve an important purpose. And just because you may particularly value this, you're devaluing the gift you have maybe. But that God has a particular purpose for that gift. And it's valuable because or else God would not have given it. So whereas we tend to immediately, when we come to that section, we start talking about talents, and that is the right way to apply it. But we need to understand in context, it was talking about the miraculous gifts they'd been provided. So we've been provided providential gifts, but not miraculous gifts. Different things that we're able to do. And that the same thing is true, though, that you may not have the same talents as another person. Value the talents that you can use properly in accordance with God's will for what He wants you to do and what He wants everyone to do, and to make the most and still value that. Develop what you have, but don't get around to being jealous and saying, well, I don't have this talent, so I'm not going to do anything. No, you've got a valuable talent too, so use it in the way that accords with Scriptures. This was such a problem that then he has to address their motives. And that's what chapter 13 is about. Why we talk about it being the chapter on love. It says, you need to address this. It says, all these, and that's why he starts by talking about the miraculous in chapter 13. If you have all the miraculous ability in the world, you don't have love, you're nothing. He says, you're just noisy. You're sitting there making all this and saying all these things. It says, doesn't matter. If you're not doing it for the right reasons or with the right motive or the right heart, the right character, there's a problem, which is important when we talk to people. Are we talking to people about their souls and for their benefit and their growth, or are we trying to talk to them and is it all about us? Better not be about us, okay? So make sure you get the motive down to love. Verses 4 through 7 then, he describes what that looks like, okay? That is, love is going to look a particular way. It's going to be manifested with particular behaviors, kindness, being centered on others and their benefit. It's going to mean that I'm not going to be talking about myself. I'm not going to be doing all those kind of things. It's just going to be that this is what is best for that moment, for that person, is what I'm running through and considering. And then, verses 8 through 10, he explains why it's so important. One of the reasons why that matters so much is he says, these gifts that y'all are clamoring over, they're not going to be around forever. There's going to be a time in which they're going to go away when that which is perfect has come. And we talked about what that is, and all the reasons why that perfect thing, it's not perfection as some translate it, it's an adjective, and it's a complete thing as compared to what those things that were incomplete were. The incomplete were the miraculous. The complete is what completed all the miraculous. All the miraculous were about getting the message of God, the gospel, out there. So what is the completed message? And so as he finishes that up in verses 11 through 13, he's pointing out that you're clinging to the wrong things here. And that's where he ends. And now abide faith, hope, love, these three, but the greatest of these, love. It's love. No. That is the Word of God. It is completed form. That's why it's a perfect thing. It's not perfection as a noun, and it's an adjective. It's neuter, which means if it were Jesus, it would be masculine. Be the perfect one, perfect person. This is the perfect thing, the complete thing. And depending upon your translation, there are some places that get that wrong there. But so you need to make sure to have that faith, hope. Okay, you're trusting God. Notice, you're trusting God. Hope, which is based upon what God said and promised. Right? Hope is the reaction to God's promises. And then love, which is your returning how God has treated you. And that is the core. Why is love greatest? Is because faith is not going to be necessary ultimately when you're in God's presence. Hope is going to be realized, but love and the relationship can go on in eternity. That's beautiful about that. Chapter 14 then, having established the motive, he goes down to regulating it, particularly in the assembly of what he is doing here. And the focus here mainly is on its purpose in edification. That no matter what, all these were given to be able to provide the message and to anticipate and help people grow spiritually. Let all things be done for edification, verse 26 says. And this is all on the basis, if you drop down to verse 33, of why is that it all works together. And this is also bringing together everything that we had beginning in chapter 12. When it says, for God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. He started with the unity from the Spirit being the original source, providing different miraculous gifts to provide one single message so that those people who have the miraculous gifts will present a unified one single message. They need to add. Our responsibility is not adding to the message, it's adding our heart to the people with the message and then communicating that for their growth, edification spiritually, so that people can be what they ought to be and learn what they need to learn. And that all that needs to fall in line with God wants it orderly. They were approaching this as doing whatever they wanted. He says, no, it needs to be united around what God's will is. That's why he ended there with verse 40. So chapter 15 now is an entire argument about the resurrection. He starts first 11 verses with evidence for, number one, the first 4 verses, that this is the core of the gospel, is not just the crucifixion, which he talked on in chapter 1, but also the resurrection. And that there is plenty of evidence for that, which was verses 5 through 11. He then applied a logical form called a sorites, a series of questions going back and saying, if you're going to reject that, you just toss everything aside. You toss aside resurrection, you toss aside Jesus and the gospel. But the good news is that Jesus was raised from the dead. He's the first fruits, meaning you're going to be raised too. Verse 20. And then he talks about and develops that through verse 28 about what he will hand the kingdom over to God. He then transitions from that beginning in verse 29, and you begin talking about here are the natural effects that come from this. You've fallen prey to this because you're listening to the wrong people. But then, beginning in verse 35 through verse 49, he starts talking about in objections about to the body. He says, well, number one, God can do this, but it's going to be a different body. It's a type of different body. Okay, we tend to always. It's always one of those things where you assume, well, it's raised up and here's what you got. It's just this time, second time around. And instead of understanding, he actually puts it in a higher context than that and saying what God can do. Hang on. He ends by talking about the great victory that this shows not only for Jesus, but for all of us. He closes by what you would expect, which is things involving his travel plans, which is where their giving came in for the brethren at Jerusalem, and then all his personal plans. That's important when you go into 2 Corinthians. And then he pulls all this together in those closing exhortations of why they needed to pay attention to what they're doing and stand fast for the truth and to do things in love. And all of this, ultimately, as you looked last time, 19 through 24, is don't lose sight. It's all because of Jesus, and that needs to be at the center of all that we do. Okay, that was 1 Corinthians. And I think I know what I'm going to do next week. Am I teaching next week, elders? We'll see. Okay. Thank you for staying with me for the study. I hope that you learned a lot of different ways that this book is valuable, and don't be downing those Corinthians. They were doing their best.